forgot. Hello friends, and welcome to another edition of Transformational Astrology, which is going to be a very special edition. We're going to talk about Earth Day, and coincidentally, it's coming up on the new moon in a couple of days on Earth Day, on the April 22nd. And further coincidentally, it's the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. So we do want to make a big deal about this, especially since it ties right into my recent research into Earth-oriented planets, nature-oriented planets, which are beyond Pluto, which are also named by the IAU as officially designated dwarf planets, which is also very interesting. There are the only other two dwarf planets besides Eris, and Eris has been shown to be very important in charts. So the logical conclusion, therefore, is that these new planets have to be significant as well. Not have to be, but are logically presumed to be, and actually I've been doing the research and that they have been shown to be. And my article came out in the Mountain Astrology magazine this month, which is April, and we will have information on the site about how to order a copy of the article if you're interested in doing that. We'll put a note in the YouTube. No, let's see, I guess, do we just announce that? Well, we'll put that in a comment, I guess, for the Facebook Live, and then later on there'll be a YouTube presentation of it also, in case you don't have Facebook. Well, that would be people that get it later on, of course. So we do have a couple of people gathered, and you will be able to buy just one issue. And we will be talking, I'm just kind of going to give you a general overview, because we'll be talking about things that I think are of fascinating interest to just people that are kind of exploring astrology. What is astrology able to do for us? You know, just getting your feet wet, so to speak, with astrology. And I think it'll be fascinating for those people that are experts in astrology, because these are new planets, and the evidence is really compelling that they are significant in charts, and furthermore, that they do represent a connection to nature. So the fact that they are named after indigenous gods and goddesses, the only officially named planets, quote-unquote planets, that are so named, that made me think that they might have something to do with the profound connection to nature, which is very typical of indigenous cultures. And so I started doing that research several years ago, and I've looked at hundreds of charts. And it's very true, and I can demonstrate, I'll give you a little iconic demonstration of some of, I think, the very interesting charts that you can spot this for yourself and see that these are, in fact, inclined toward nature. And then we'll see how these planets interact with Earth Day, both past and present. And when I say past, I'm not going to go through the history of different major Earth Days. There have been some. Earth Day was first done as a teach-in on April 22nd of 1970. And it was done by a man named Gaylord Nelson, who was a U.S. Senator and who was considered the #1 environmentalist in the country when he did this. And he had some help, and it just ballooned. It's so amazing. They originally thought about doing it in the 20th of March rather than April. So interesting. They wound up with the 22nd of April, and that is the beginning of Taurus, and Taurus is the first Earth sign. So, you know, it just ties right into astrology from the very beginning, although that was unintentional on their part. So the first Earth Day, Gaylord Nelson, 1970, you know, it followed the dynamic 60s, which was quite a time when people really started thinking about these things, thinking about our connection to the Earth, getting back to the Earth. You know, that was very important in those days, and recognizing that we are natural creatures in our essence. We try to be all intellectual ever since the Enlightenment period, but we are actually natural creatures. And in fact, our subjectivity in particular is very tied into nature. As people like Jung and people like Joseph Campbell firmly articulated, Joseph Campbell said that myth was the way to connect back to nature. And in fact, both Jung and Joseph Campbell have strong Haumea, which is one of these two nature planets, in their charts, which is fascinating. So this is the 50th anniversary, and we want to take a look at some charts. So let's go right into that, because there's a lot of material here to cover. So you should be able to see the Earth Day coming up. And this is a new moon in Taurus, at 3 degrees of Taurus. You can see my mouse, I think. And it's close. Oh, I hear that I'm not showing the chart. That's not good. Okay. You should see the chart, though. That. Yeah, I think you were seeing the chart, actually. So the other thing about this chart that's interesting, it's quite fascinating, is that these two planets, these Earth planets, Makemake and Haumea, are actually both involved in this chart in a certain very special way. This is Makemake, by the way, and this symbol represents a birdman because Makemake was actually, it's also a variation of Pluto glyph. Both of these glyphs that I use are representations that are variations on the Pluto glyph, which is the chalice glyph that you're all familiar with. They don't have the cross below, and they have a variation of the chalice above. But they are essentially similar. This circle here is the similar size circle as the Pluto glyph. And also Eris is a similar size circle. They're all kind of related to each other since they're all out there in the Kuiper Belt. And they're all dwarf planets now. They're all named as dwarf planets, but still planets. And the funny thing about I want to mention that Makemake in this chart is actually, when we look at the ascendant in Washington, D.C., which is represented here, it's about 4 degrees 52 minutes. You can see that it's less than a degree away, so it's a sextile to the ascendant. Interestingly, also Haumea is square, perfectly square to Jupiter in Capricorn. So, and Jupiter is something that comes up. It's the ruler of this chart as far as if we do the chart for Washington, D.C., national chart. And it comes up in Earth Day a couple of times. I'll show you in just a minute. So, and the other thing to note, just to let you know the groundwork for this, the beginning of this was when I first looked at the April 22nd chart for this year. The midpoint of these two is exactly 16 degrees of Libra. 16 degrees of Libra makes a perfect trine to Mars at 16 degrees of Aquarius. And it's a grand trine with Venus at 15 degrees of Gemini. So it's a grand trine in air. Venus is actually the ruler of the new moon in Taurus, whereas Mars is actually the ruler of Eris, which is where we have Eris located, and we have an Eris-Mercury conjunction happening at this same timing. So as the ruler of Eris and also Mercury, and as the ruler of the new moon and also Uranus, these two planets forming a grand trine with the midpoint of these two nature planets is, I believe, quite significant. So the bottom line on this whole talk is that we have a big, significant Earth Day coming up, not only the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, but these planets are very involved now, and I think also the COVID situation that we're all in, the sheltering in place, the reliance on scientific data is actually kind of a precursor for a greater involvement in environmental concerns and climate change, which I believe is coming up this year as society adjusts. We're in the middle of a big transformation of society, and we realize that we do have to pay attention to the scientists, even though there's kind of a rebellious impulse in this country not to do that. It turns out to be important. So let's take a look real quick here, because I do have so much material, at Earth Day 1970. And Earth Day 1970 is very interesting. Again, there is a strong involvement of Jupiter. Jupiter is opposite the Sun, and in fact, there was a full moon. You can see the moon is just past that point. There was a full moon, which we also have the chart of, so let's take a look at that real quick too. So this is the full moon just before the first Earth Day. It was the night before, or the day before, at 11:20 in the morning. And so this particular full moon, very interestingly, is right aligned with Jupiter. We have Jupiter at 1 degree and 5 minutes, the moon at 1 degree 8 minutes, opposite the sun at 1 degree and 8 minutes of Taurus. So this is interesting stuff, is it not? You can see what Jupiter has to do with Earth Day. Jupiter is all about beliefs. It's all about the future. So this is a new set of beliefs that involves the Earth as an important player in the whole social situation that we're in. Gaylord Nelson had a comment that was prescient in his time, which was that we are not accidentally part of the environment, but rather our economic activity is a part of the environment, so that the environment comes first and our social and civilized activity comes second. Without the earth, where are we? What can we do without the environment, the earth environment that we live in? As people that are into the environmental movement are fond of saying, there is no planet B, right? So besides Jupiter, we have a very strong presence of Neptune in this chart. One sign over at 0 degrees of Sag, therefore making angles with the sun and moon in this full moon. And Neptune is also very idealistic. Neptune looks beyond the current situation to see further dimensions of the situation, what we can imagine, what we can create in terms of a spiritual connection. And if we take a look at the actual ascendant, this one is a Placidus chart showing the ascendant at 1 degree of Leo, also Washington, D.C. On the full moon preceding the very first Earth Day, you can see that there's a strong trine and there's a strong square to the sun and moon from this ascendant. So this is all very dramatic stuff to see how the first Earth Day, and I'll put this chart away now, to see how the first Earth Day in 1970 really aligned. All those alignments, of course, are still present in this chart the next day, which I've done for 12 noon. And I've also done it having Eris on the ascendant rather than having the actual ascendant. The midheaven would be where the sun is. And that would be an interesting way to look at the chart too. So let's go ahead and look at that. So if I go to the house calculations and I say I don't want to use the natural sign, I want to use just Placidus houses, you can see that way it's a little bit more dramatic because we have the sun right at the top of the chart. We have all these Taurus planets. The sun is there, Saturn is there, Mercury and Venus are both there, opposite the Scorpio moon, and we talked about that full moon that was just before. And take a look at Eris at 12 degrees of Aries, exact partile trine to Makemake, which is 12 degrees of Leo. And the thing is, I have determined that both of these nature planets, Haumea and Makemake, are actually involved in profound connection to nature, with Makemake being the more environmentally active and the more active in general for Earth issues. So this is quite something to see this coming up in the original chart for Earth Day, the 50 years ago Earth Day chart, that there's a partile trine between Eris and Makemake. So the thing that I want to cover when we talk about these two nature planets is I really do want to mention a little bit more about the mythology of the planets so you can understand where I'm coming from. So let's take a break from these charts and just consider where these planets come from. So Haumea, which is represented, as I say, let's go back to Earth Day 2020. And here are the two nature planets, Makemake, which comes from the culture of the Rapa Nui people, and they had this very important myth of theirs of the Birdman. This Makemake was their creation god. And the Birdman was who ruled in the sense of providing the philosophical groundwork for their culture. There would be every year a competition amongst young athletic people who were men who were the representative, the champion of these elders, who then vied to be the Birdman for that year. And if the young man who was competing got back to the main island, there's a rocky landmass nearby that had birds nesting there, and if they brought back the first egg from the birds in the spring, that would be, and they got all the way back to their home base, they had to climb a dangerous cliff with the egg tied into their headdress. So it was a competition very much like our triathlon. They had to swim, they had to run, they had to climb. And if they made it back, the first one with the first egg of the season, they were the one that was their Birdman. Their elder would become the Birdman for the year. So that's a very interesting. You can see how closely that whole culture is tied to the natural cycles of spring and resurgence, and the birds making their eggs. So that's very interesting. And then if we talk about Haumea for a minute, it's even more fascinating, really, because Haumea was the creation goddess of the Hawaii people. She's the mother of Pele, for example. She's the mother of many of the Hawaiian, I think all the Hawaiian gods and goddesses. She had a magic wand that could make food appear. In mimicry of the natural fecundity of the island culture, which there was food everywhere, growing everywhere. And in another way of representing the fecundity of nature, she would give birth from all different parts of her body, and she would regenerate to a young woman again. So I think that's fascinating because it's almost like an image of nature. Nature is always creating new forms, always varied, always fluctuating, always changing, and always available to us in a protean way to bring new life, in a sense. So that's the background, the mythological background of these two planets, and you can see why I thought they may very well represent a profound connection to nature. And to explore that a little bit more, let's go to the chart of John Muir. Now, John Muir was one of the first charts I looked at. He's just a fascinating person. And if we go to the natal, you can see that I was looking to see, of course, in this chart, he was one of the first environmentalists. He wandered the woods and nature from just before his 30th birthday. And I document this in the article that's just published in Mountain Astrologer, by the way, pretty extensively. He was a factory foreman, and he had an industrial accident, and it changed his life entirely. And he just decided, he almost lost the sight of both his eyes, but when his sight was restored, he felt like he had to just explore the natural world. It was so important to him. And he did become very famous scientifically. He had theories of glaciation. He explored Yosemite wilderness thoroughly. And he started writing about it and writing about nature, and he was one of the very first environmentalists and wanted to set aside, for example, Yosemite. That was before Yosemite was a national park. He was instrumental in helping that come about. And then also Teddy Roosevelt was important with him. They had a friendship, and it was around the issues of nature, and they met and did a camping trip in Yosemite when I think it was 1903 or 05, I can't remember. But anyway, let me just show you the Haumea that I was looking for in John Muir's chart. Now, when you first glance at this, you may not realize it, but Haumea is just about on the midpoint of Eris and Uranus. And it's also connected to other parts of his chart as well. Let's see, I can't remember exactly. Well, okay. Also, we have Makemake. And Makemake is in a quintile to his natal Mars, I believe, and Pluto. Both Mars and Pluto. So, and there is another connection that Haumea makes to his chart that I don't want to go into in great detail at the moment. But not only were these prominent in his chart, but I also looked at the chart of Teddy Roosevelt. And that's very interesting because, Teddy Roosevelt was worried about resources dwindling, and he made the famous statement, the time has come to inquire seriously about what will happen when our forests are gone, when the coal, the iron, the oil are exhausted. So the thing that's fascinating to me about that is he did have Makemake and Eris in partile conjunction at 5 degrees of Pisces at the very top of the chart. We have his time. And he was the environmental president. He was somebody that set aside huge amounts of land for the national parks, which had already been established before his presidency. And if we look at the comparison between John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt, which we can do this way, bring up the comparison chart, and that's already loaded. And if you look at this, it's again quite interesting because Makemake and Eris at 5 degrees are exactly one sign over from his 5-degree Makemake. That's a partile, semi-sextile between that configuration in his chart and the Makemake in John Muir's chart, who was, of course was born 20 years earlier, born in 1838 versus 1858. And then if you look at his Haumea lines up with the north node of Muir. So this is a fascinating, and then his 5-degree Makemake aligns to the Haumea. You can't see underneath these lines, but if we look over here, you can actually see his Haumea is 4 degrees Pisces, 27 minutes. So that's a very close 1-degree conjunction between Teddy Roosevelt's Makemake and Eris conjunction and Muir, which makes sense because they were almost partners in the idea of actually the valley, Yosemite was a national park, but the valley was not part of it until Teddy Roosevelt came along and they partnered in that effort to make, which turned it to the full Yosemite Park that we know today. So these are just real quick glimpses of these things and very interesting. And let me show you also another chart. So here's the chart of Julia Butterfly. Julia Butterfly was very famous because she was able to save this tree, Luna. I don't know how many people know the story of Julia Butterfly. It was a very well-known story at the time, back in the late 90s. They were cutting down the trees. There was a tree that was, I think, 500 years old. It was one of the oldest trees in the woods. It was big. She named it Luna, and she fought to save it from the logging. Why would you cut this down for wood when it's one of the oldest creatures on Earth? Now, one would think from this environmental activity of hers that she was inspired, that she was individualistic, because what she did was she climbed the tree. She actually climbed Luna and lived in Luna for 2 winters, which was quite something to go through because there were winter storms, and she was in a little platform up there, and she was supplied, of course, with food from the ground, from her group, from the environmental group that she belonged to, but it was a hard thing that she did. And they couldn't get her out of the tree, and they couldn't cut the tree down without killing her. And she wound up saving the tree. Luna was saved. Some acreage around that tree, that's a permanent, set-aside monument. So what would we think about Julia Butterfly Hill in terms of Makemake and Haumea? She should have plenty of both, right? If you look, she has Haumea at 12 degrees of Virgo, and that is a partile connection to her natal Eris at 12 degrees of Aries. So that's a very strong connection showing that her individualistic spiritual warrior stance that she took had a lot to do with love of nature, Haumea. And also we can see that, in fact, also Makemake was a partile connection to her Chiron in Aries. So there's a Eris-Chiron conjunction that connects to both Haumea and Makemake. And you can actually go a lot further than that. If you look at some of these more poignant details, for example, Haumea being exactly opposite Mercury, and she wrote about her adventure, and she wrote about, saving nature and how important that was. And if we look at her transits for when she climbed the tree, which we will look at the most recent transit, and that was put up ahead of time so we don't have to be typing things in, you can see it's, again, a fascinating synastry with the actual synastry with the transiting planets is what I'm talking about. So, for example, transiting Makemake was right on her natal Haumea. She was about 30 years old when this happened. Well, not quite. She was like 23, I guess. But anyway, it turns out that Haumea had moved till where it was conjunct her natal. Makemake, rather, had moved, and it's conjunct the North Node transiting-wise, too, had moved to conjunct her natal Haumea. Haumea was conjunct her Pluto. Eris had moved to 18 degrees conjunct her natal Chiron. And there's several other transits that you can make. Look, everything's at 18 degrees. Transiting Eris is at 18 degrees of Aries. Transiting Jupiter comes in 18 degrees of Aquarius. And the Sun was at 18 degrees that day of Sag. And why is 18 degrees significant? Well, it pretty much matches up to her 17-degree Leo Makemake. So all these transits are coming into her Makemake, which again to me, and this is the day she climbed the tree, right? So to me this indicates that Makemake is a more activist of the two, and it is the male god of the pair, and Haumea seems to be a lover of nature without limit, whereas Makemake and more just passively being involved in nature and philosophically, also seeing nature's spiritual path. Whereas Makemake has a lot to do, it's also very similar to that, but it has a lot to do with also activism. And you can see that reflected in some of these parts of this chart. So, heading into another example would be Leonardo Dicaprio, and this is the last example I'm going to give right now. So, what we have with Leonardo DiCaprio, he's a very famous actor, of course, and he has plenty of money, but he's also been an environmental activist, and he addressed the UN on Earth Day of 2016. And once again, we can look in his chart, and we can see the presence of these nature planets. We can see that Haumea is at 14 degrees of Virgo, and meanwhile, almost 13 degrees of Eris is his natal Eris, so that makes a connection. Connects to his moon as well, which is 15 degrees of Libra. And the Sun and Saturn also, by the way, are trying each other, so he's determined and he's steadfast and he works hard to make what he believes is important happen. Chiron is connected to his Makemake, so the environmentalism, which he's demonstrated amply. He created this movie before the flood talking about what's going to happen when the seas rise and when we have problems with climate change. Well, that connects to also Chiron, which is the painful situation, and it also connects to Makemake, which is his, in 19 degrees of Leo, it's less than 2 degrees from a perfect trine. So there's more, we could talk more. He does have this square between the Sun and Makemake also, very strong. So these planets are a strong presence I looked at hundreds of charts, as I say, and it never disappointed. It really was very clear to me that these Earth-oriented planets do show up when you would expect them, depending on the person who is involved. And let's see. Where else are we going here? Yes, that wasn't the last example chart. Greta Thunberg. When Greta Thunberg's Greta Thunberg's activity came along, I was very interested to see if she would demonstrate a strong Eris, because she practically acts out Eris. It's a feminine warrior energy. They don't care about the consequences. They don't care what other people think. They're just going to make it happen. Paradigm shifting people. And that's been documented very well in some of my writing, like the book I wrote, The 10th Planet, about Eris, and people are beginning to recognize Eris as an important planet now. Well, Greta, I would expect to have both a strong Eris and a strong Makemake. And sure enough, if you look at her chart, she does have a partile inconjunct between Makemake at 19 degrees of Virgo, and again, like with Julia also, Julia Butterfly Hill, a very strong partile connection to Eris, 19 degrees of Aries. And in fact, this is a yod with Mars at 21 degrees of Scorpio contributing the sextile, which makes the whole yod happen. So, and by the way, Eris is also square her sun degree and possibly her moon degree if she's born early morning, which this is evidence that she might have been born early morning since she has such a strong Eris. She could have easily been born any time in the early part of the day before 6 a.m. Or right around there, right around 6. So this is another iconic chart, and you can see how it comes about. I looked at Greta Thunberg and her activity. I didn't look at her chart and say, oh, gee, interesting, she has strong Makemake. But rather, I looked at Greta Thunberg because I suspected strong Makemake, because she is such an environmental activist and spiritual warrior for her cause, and implacable spiritual warrior for her cause. She doesn't take any crap from anybody, and she's telling the leaders of the world that they're screwing up when she addressed the UN herself. So that's the background, and the purpose of that was to share with you some of my research and just to show you why I think it makes sense to consider these new nature planets to be what I call them, which is nature planets, that they both represent a profound connection to nature, with Makemake being a bit more on the activist side. So as we research Earth Day, and as we talk about Earth Day, we want to reflect upon how that came about. It was originally going to be a teach-in on April 22nd of 1970, which then became a movement. And the person that was the keynote speaker in Philadelphia was Edmund Muskie, who was a well-known environmentalist politician in his day. And also there's Gaylord Nelson, whose idea it was and who kind of made the whole thing happen. So I guess you can think about where this might be going. Let's check out Gaylord Nelson and see how he stands with these new planets. Well, Uranus is at 19 degrees of Aquarius, and Haumea is at 17 degrees of Cancer. So that is a very strong inconjunct there. And we do see that Chiron is important to him, to his chart, because any planet that's close to Eris, that has a close aspect to Eris as a conjunction, becomes important. So he was very sensitive to the pain of the situation. And in fact, this also connects to his nodal axis, which is at 29 degrees. And, oh yeah, that's right, and it connects to Jupiter. Jupiter being at 26 degrees of Eris is exactly partile, semi-sextile to this Chiron, so he's thinking for himself. He's aware of the painful situation that our beliefs and our philosophies don't always match up to where they need to be. And so he's departing on his own course, and that does make a square to his nodal axis, the south node at 29 of Cancer and the north node at 29 Capricorn. So Jupiter is squaring that axis, which makes it prominent. And it turns out that Makemake is actually the stronger of these two nature planets, being conjunct his sun. We have his time. No, we don't. This is a sunrise chart. We don't have his time of birth, so we're doing it from the sunrise. But it is conjunct his sun, and there's a whole series of planets here. Mercury is also in this picture of Gemini, which is 2 degrees away from the sun, 4 degrees away from Mercury. That's a pretty strong presence of Makemake, and he did have a thoughtful approach to that kind of activism that was necessary. It was, after all, a teach-in. He was trying to convey information, as indicated by the presence of Mercury, and then Mercury also ties into the Haumea next door sign, the next sign over. And that was also in conjunction with Saturn, which is, this determination, this making things concretely happen, which he certainly did. I mean, he started something with Earth Day, which has spread to 192 countries throughout the world, always on the 22nd of April, which matches the beginning of Taurus. So it's all quite interesting, isn't it? Now, one more quick chart, and then we'll go to the philosophical implications of all this. And that is, which I don't have showing, here's the chart of Edmund Muskie. Edmund Muskie was the politician who was the keynote speaker at the very first Earth Day in Philadelphia. I mean, it happened in various places. It happened in New York also. They closed Fifth Avenue for it. And if we take a look at Edmund Muskie's chart, he has a triple conjunction in Cancer, but a close partile conjunction as part of that between Haumea and Mars. So that you would say right there, that's pretty strong Haumea. It's trine the north node conjunct Chiron. So Chiron keeps coming up in these people that are environmentally active and that realize that the Earth situation, the climate change situation is very real, very scary, very powerful, very painful. It's a difficult situation that we have to deal with. You can look at a little bit more in here too, I think. We would want to see where is Makemake. and Makemake is actually square, no, I'm sorry, trine, is actually trine to his Uranus Jupiter, and once again you have these prominent planets, Jupiter being prominent again. In fact, Jupiter is at 14 degrees of Aquarius, exact in conjunct to his natal Haumea Mars conjunction. So Jupiter keeps coming up. They want to see the future be improved. They have a future orientation, these people. And so this is, what I'm pointing out here is these are the charts connected with Earth Day and the research on what happened 50 years ago when Earth Day was founded. And sure enough, these are not example charts I've had around for a long time. You won't find these in the article. This is what I just looked at. This just popped up when I started looking at what was going on as far as the beginning of Earth Day. So I think this is all quite interesting. And the most important thing about all of this, as we recognize that Earth Day is coming up, is that what we're in the midst of right now with COVID-19 is actually something that is very similar to the scientist's viewpoint on climate change, which has been very widely ignored. There was a time back in the late in the 70s, in fact, beginning with Earth Day in 1970, 1979, I think was a big moment in that, when there was a huge environmental movement. People were aware that the carbon in the atmosphere was causing problems, that there was global warming happening as a result, that the fossil fuel companies were directly involved because their profits depended on burning a lot of fossil fuel, and in fact it wasn't that great for the planet. So all of that was in ferment in the 70s. But then what's happened since then? How many years have gone by? 40 years have gone by since 1979, when there was kind of a powerful movement to try to do something about this. And it's been largely ignored, probably because of the influence of the fossil fuel companies. Also because it's not obvious to people. They look outside, they see a normal day, they see a blue sky, they have a cold winter. It snowed last winter, there can't be that bad of a climate change. So, it doesn't affect us at an emotional level because it doesn't feel real. What we have to turn around, and it's invisible to us, but what we have to do is turn around and see how the scientific viewpoint is really informing our understanding, and that we really better pay attention to the scientific viewpoint, because that is an accurate depiction of something that is overtaking us, and the predictions are all coming true. The weather patterns being more unstable is coming true. The sea level rise and the melting of the Arctic ice caps and Greenland is coming true. And the temperature change that's been chronicled. I mean, we've had the warmest, the last 5 or 10 years have been some of the warmest on record. I mean, even the warmest. So, it's beginning to be obvious, but it's beginning to be obvious, but it takes a certain amount of realization that, that the science information, just like the coronavirus, we're fighting an invisible enemy. We're doing it along the lines of social distancing and becoming more aware that testing is needed to take a scientific approach to what's happening so that we can defend ourselves against something that's very real, that's actually killing people. And I think it's such a parallel with the environmental situation with climate change. So this is the main message that I have, is that it is really time to pay attention to these things, as Earth Day would have us know. And that this Earth Day, which is not only the 50th anniversary, but is also in the midst of this global pandemic that makes us realize that science does have a place in our lives. It's a place of telling us what's coming. There's a way we can understand it from that, just like we can understand more about what's happening in our lives using astrology, because the astrology is quite compelling, that these planets have been named and discovered, named officially by the IAU and discovered to have these Earth-oriented meanings, as it can be shown by research, just like Eris, which represents the rising feminine, which is coming to a new flowering in this decade. Well, in this previous decade, I should say, of the teens, and even more so today, all the women leaders that are being elected, for example. So, these new planets really do have a lot to contribute to our understanding of what's happening right now in our culture. We're in the midst of this huge cultural transformation, as indicated by Saturn-Pluto, which came together at the very beginning of the year, will come together again near the end of the year on the 15th of November. And we also have the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, which happens every 20 years, which is very big this year, which is the 0-degree point of Aquarius. So we're in the midst of huge societal change, and it does involve, among other things, the recognition that we are doing damage to the Earth and that we have to do something about it. And of course, the other thing about the COVID-19 situation is the blue skies over Wuhan, China, that all over there's less air pollution than there was before because some of the economic activity has been stifled by the order, closing factories because too much possibility of transmission of disease. So I think this is all extremely fascinating. I'm hoping that you all have found it so. And we do have time to take questions. Leslie, do we have any questions that came about? Okay. Okay, cool. That's very important. Yeah, that's good. What Ellie is bringing up is that Chiron is actually opposite to Makemake in this chart. And this is something I had been meaning to mention, but I forgot. As part of this, what's happening right now, looking at the 2020 chart, which is, of course, where we are, that as you could see over and over again, Chiron keeps coming up in the charts of these environmentalists, as well it might, because it does represent a painful situation. It really represents a hidden danger emerging from the psyche that we have to be aware of and we have to deal with. So that's where we get the idea of the wounded healer and our own inner complexes that are getting in the way of what we need to do to move forward. So there's a couple of ways that we can relate that opposition between Chiron is almost 7 degrees and Makemake is at 5 degrees of Libra, just exactly opposite. So that's one very important thing. And then Eris has also been opposite to Haumea, and that's been happening for quite a while. So I believe that this has been building, this understanding that we're in the midst of something very important regarding nature, that the societal transformation that we're in the midst of has to do as much with nature as with anything, and that these planets are making themselves known in our culture, being named by the IAU as planets. These are the 4 largest planets in the Kuiper Belt that are called the new dwarf planets, the name, quote-unquote, dwarf planets. And they're not naming anymore right now. These are the big ones, and these are the ones that have kind of lodged in the astronomers' viewpoint as important enough to have planetary names. There are a lot of other bodies out there in the Kuiper Belt, just to mention. I'm not concerning myself with them so much, but that's not because I don't think it's important to look at those. They're candidates to be named as dwarf planets possibly in the future. And I just think it's quite interesting, the ones that are officially named by the IAU, which is, as I say, Pluto, Eris, and then Haumea and Makemake. So yes, that's a good thing to point out. That was Ella, is that right? Ellie, I'm sorry. Well, Ellie, thank you very much for making that comment, because that is something that I intended to mention, that Chiron comes into this particular timing as well. Chiron is important also because of being connected to Uranus. Uranus is part of this whole configuration, and Uranus is the bringer of new ideas, being able to take a different point of view on things, surprising revelations that just come about all of a sudden. And certainly there's a suddenness about this whole, as far as the human race is concerned, there's a bit of a suddenness that's happening with understanding how vital the climate change issue is, and how it may be quite quick, and they say we have 12 years to try to correct the situation before it's really damaging to populations on the planet, human populations. So we got another one, or? Okay. Oh, okay. Yes. Well, I've been reminded by my producer, Leslie Benson, who is also an astrologer working with us here at Astrograph Software, that in fact, we do have all our reports on sale in honor of Earth Day for 25% off, and the software as well. So the TimePassages software, which is very handy, is also on 25% off sale. And one of the reports is an Eris report, so you can actually see where the Eris connections in your natal chart are, even if you don't have the TimePassages software. Now, if you did have the TimePassages software, you would be able to see what a Mercury-Eris conjunction, if this was somebody's natal chart, what that might represent. We just go and find that. And, well, there's a moon conjunction too, which is actually quite a bit bigger. See, I can probably do it more easily by going to the aspect grid. So if we look in the aspects for this chart, and we look at Eris, and we look at Mercury, we can see the conjunction, and then you get an interpretation of that when you click. It's almost always a writer, I find. So somebody born 2 days from now does have this Mercury, forming Mercury conjunction. It's not just 2 days from now, of course, it's over the period of time that Mercury is in conjunction with Eris. And it does represent usually somebody that is very attached to their mental capabilities and their communicative capabilities, as Mercury would indicate. Whatever Eris touches really comes out, really it brings it out in the chart, including the house position. So that's all, and you can click on the house position as well, Eris in the 5th. So the software does give you information, but we have all that information compiled for you in this Eris report that you can get, and it's even on sale right now with all the other reports as we're celebrating Earth Day. So I do want to mention that the software, I do want to mention that the software makes it very easy to see these positions. And whereas you won't find such a good interpretation for Makemake and Haumea, we do talk about how they were discovered and what you might think about. Protein flexibility, of course, it's a connection to nature as well. This was written a long time ago. So what's our other one? Janine. I'll have to ask for more information on that. The grand solar minimum of 33 years, is that what she's saying? Okay, I think that has to do with declination, but maybe she could clarify. I'm not really familiar with that. Okay, so Janine, if you're still listening, there's a clarification that we need on what you're talking about there. A 33-year grand solar minimum, not sure. I know there is a sunspot cycle of 11 years, but that's a different thing. Yeah, so that was mainly what I wanted to get across. I think it was nice and succinct. I mean, I don't usually talk about these things so quickly, and obviously there's more example charts that could be brought to bear. I do have a few more that are in the article, and there will be a book forthcoming that will go into more detail about some of the other, I have just tons of example charts. It's quite amazing to contemplate these new planetary bodies and charts. Okay, and then Leslie says she's putting a link in the comments to, I guess, the best way to get the book, which I wrote, which is called The 10th Planet. And that's a lot of detail about Eris. The forthcoming book will have more detail about these other two new ones, which I'm just really beginning to get. Well, now I really understand their meaning for sure, and I'll be beginning to write it up. And I think there'll be a book coming out in a few years on it. But as far as Eris, I wrote a great book describing a lot of example charts and how I characterize Eris as a feminine warrior, a spiritual warrior, and supportive soul intention, because it is also way out in the Kuiper Belt, just like Pluto has a lot to do with soul depth. The further out planets have to do with going deeper inside. So there'll be a link to, I guess we have a page on it in our website, and you can also just get it on Amazon if you look on Amazon for The 10th Planet or for Henry Seltzer, you'll find it. Oh. Yeah, well, Janine did get back to us that there's a 33-year cycle which has to do with temperature on Earth, and I guess that would be a counterindication to rising temperatures, which we are seeing. They've been measured, and I don't know much about that. So that was her comment. You can see it in the comments section, I believe. And I think we're going to wind up. This was about the length that we wanted to do. Don't forget that the software is on sale if you want to take advantage of this Earth Day sale. And we are donating some of our proceeds to an organization that has to do with planting trees for every $1 that's donated. I'm sorry, what did you say? Oh, okay, it's onetreeplanted.org if you want to know more about that. And we're donating a percentage of the proceeds from our Earth Day sale, which will cover a few days. I can't give you the microphone exactly since we're having to isolate, but Leslie, what was the time period for that sale? Okay, up until the 23rd at midnight is our Earth Day sale that we're doing, just kind of to make a splash and to donate a little bit and to let people know that astrology counts and that there's a way that astrology is informing us about how we go through these important milestones in our lives. So I guess that's... Oh, we do have a question, okay. Okay, well, I can answer that question. There is a group, and oh, I'm sorry, the question was, how am I personally celebrating Earth Day? And it turns out there's an online concert, which is going to be a Facebook Live event. A dear friend of mine that lives right across the street from me was in a group many years ago called First Light of Dawn. Oh no, it was called Mariposa, but their album was called First Light of Dawn. And her son has now grown up to be a fantastic musician. And he, with 3 of his cohorts, have founded a group called Mystic Tiger. And they have a wonderful song called Third Eye of the Tiger. And the idea is that really spiritual necessity doesn't necessarily involve namby-pamby and just fading away and not doing stuff. It may involve a fierce attitude. And I told them at the time when I first heard their work that reminded me so much of Eris, and it turns out they all have pretty strong Eris in their charts as well, including their principal songwriter. They are doing a concert. It's a Facebook Live concert. You can probably find it if you look on Facebook under Nathan Kersey Wilson. And I recommend highly. They have some great music. It's an a cappella group with an instrumental accompanist, mostly a cappella. And that's what I'll be doing. I'll be attending their concert, which is from 7 to 9 p.m. on Wednesday, the 22nd. Well, that's great. Thanks for your interest in my work, and thanks also for tuning in about these new planets. I think it's quite fascinating, and we do want to let you know that you can buy single issues of the Mountain Astrologer magazine from the Mountain Astrologer website. So just Google that, and you'll be able to get there and figure out how to buy a current issue if you're interested in reading this article of mine. And it will be on newsstands. Well, it's on newsstands, but I don't know how many newsstands are available. It will also be available to download as an online copy, I believe, when the next issue comes out in June. So maybe by June you can download it, I'm not sure. But you can also purchase it as a single issue right now, if you're interested in more information about Makemake and Haumea, as well as Eris, these new planets out in the Kuiper Belt. It kind of changes Western astrology to some extent because we have these new bodies indicating kind of new factors in our world, in our zeitgeist. Let me transition back. And just want to say so long and thanks for watching, and we'll be doing another of these blog entries, these video blog entries in a couple more weeks with the full moon coming up that follows this new moon cycle beginning on the 22nd. So happy new moon, everybody, and have a good time staying home and maybe tuning in to a little bit more depth in what's going on within all of us. Best of luck with that. So long now.